This afternoon, we are really honored to have our speaker, the Revd Dr Rodney Holder. Reverend Holder read mathematics at Trinity College right here in Cambridge and researched for a Doctor of Philosophy and Astrophysics at Christ Church in Oxford. He then returned to Oxford and was ordained in the Church of England in 1997. After several years of parish ministry, he was appointed course director of this Faraday Institute from its inception until his retirement in January of 2013. Rodney has explored ways in which science and faith complement each other in a number of books and in 2 Faraday papers that you can find, and is a regular speaker on the relationship between religion and science, especially cosmology. He is Review's editor of Science and Christian Belief and is on the National Committee of Christians in Science. In addition, he is a member of the International Society for Science and Religion, the Society of Ordained Scientists, and the Science and Religion Forum. So we're really in for a treat this afternoon. We're going to be thinking about the cosmos and all its implications. Rodney's first talk will be Cosmology and the Christian Doctrine of Creation. Welcome.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do in this particular talk is look at the Big Bang Theory, which ostensibly takes us back to a beginning of the universe 13.8 billion years ago, what do we make of that. Then talk about the creation of the Christian doctrine of creation and creation ex nihilo, what it means to have an ultimate explanation, to explain why there is something rather than nothing, and then to consider what kind of explanation God provides. Now, you may recognize the person on the right of this photograph. I hope everybody recognizes Albert Einstein. The person on the left is not so well known, not by the public at large at any rate, but he's a very important figure in cosmology, one of the greatest cosmologists of all time. His name is Georges Lemaitre. He's the father of the Big Bang Theory. He solved Einstein's equations of general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravity, for the universe as a whole. First of all, in 1927, getting an expanding universe solution, the expansion being observed a couple of years later by Edwin Hubble, and then in 1931 with a solution which he called the primeval atom, where the universe began in a very compact initial state, which we now know to have happened some 13.8 billion years ago. And of course, an interesting thing about Lemaitre, as you can see here, and I look like this sometimes, certainly on Sundays when I'm officiating at the Eucharist and so on, that he's a priest. He was a Roman Catholic priest. He was a member of St. Edmund's College, where the Faraday is located, between 1923 and 1924, and in those days, St. Edmund's was a place where Catholic priests could reside and say Mass when they were working elsewhere in the university. And he was working with Sir Arthur Eddington in the University Observatory at that time. And indeed, Eddington was the person who publicized for the larger world Lemaitre's work. Now, it seems to me, let me just see, the Big Bang then was predicted by Lemaitre, and it's extremely well supported by evidence. First of all, the evidence of the expansion. That wasn't good enough for various other cosmologists, such as Fred Hoyle in Cambridge and his colleagues, and they came up with an alternative, the steady state theory, whereby the universe existed forever. And expansion was explained by saying that matter came into existence in the spaces between the galaxies as they are pulled apart by the expansion of space at just the right rate, an atom in the size of St. Paul's Cathedral per year or something like that. And the universe is the same yesterday, today, and forever. We have a slightly different take on that expression, especially for Christians. But that wasn't good enough. But then in 1965, we had the discovery of the cosmic background radiation by these 2 characters, Penzias and Wilson. Other cosmologists in the US reckoned that if the universe really started as a Big Bang, then as it expanded, it would have been very hot to begin with, and then it would have cooled, and it should be left with this background radiation. That was predicted in about 1948 and discovered by these two characters in 1965. And the story goes that they thought they'd got bird droppings in their antenna, when what they'd actually got was the remnant radiation from the Big Bang. That had to be explained to them by cosmologists, and it got them the Nobel Prize. So there we are. But it seems, well, let me just give you one or two pictures by way of giving you the flavor of what we're talking about in cosmology. This is a typical galaxy, 100 billion, maybe 200 billion stars, and maybe 100 or 200 billion galaxies in the observable part of the universe. So we're talking about a grand scale for the universe. This is, I think, an extremely interesting picture taken with the Hubble Space Telescope, and each of these little blobs is a galaxy, and these are the earliest galaxies to form in the universe, the Hubble Ultra Deep Field, and we're looking at the universe in this picture when it was 5% of its present age, which I think is truly, truly remarkable. When stars come into existence in the first half billion years or so of the universe's existence, then the most massive stars evolve rapidly. They produce the higher elements in the periodic table of chemical elements in their interiors by nuclear fusion. And then at the end of their lives, when they explode as supernovae, these elements that they've been created are made available for subsequent generations of stars, so that we have planets and ultimately life. And that's an example. The Crab Nebula, first observed by Chinese astronomers in the year 1054 as a new star, but now with the Hubble Space Telescope we get this wonderful filamentary structure. That's another example where a star has essentially exploded, and there's a shock wave sent into the surrounding medium, which has lit up the surrounding medium in that sort of necklace fashion. Well, now, it seems that's an incredibly rapid summary of cosmology. 13.8 billion years in about a couple of minutes. But anyway, two questions potentially relating to theology, I think, arise from this. And the first is that apparently the universe began to exist. And the second is that the universe appears fine-tuned for life. Now, my first talk is going to deal particularly with this question, and my second talk later this afternoon will deal with the second question. And the first question has really been quite troubling for atheists, as you'll see as I go on. People like, well, Fred Hoyle, to begin with, who I mentioned behind the steady state theory, hated the idea of the Big Bang. Stephen Hawking today hates the idea that the universe had a beginning, because then it would need God to create it. So we'll see how he's tried to avoid that. But then I shall also explain how, frankly, it doesn't matter from the point of view of Christian theology, because God's needed whether the universe has a finite past or an infinite past. And it is really interesting, going on to more theological ways of thinking, how some of what modern science says has virtually been preempted by Christian thinkers. This is Clement of Alexandria, about 200 AD we're talking about, who said this: how could creation take place in time, seeing that time was born along with things which exist? The idea being that space and time are intimately linked and they both come into existence together, which is a part of Christian doctrine, essentially, that time and space are both created together, but it seems to be entirely consonant with what the Big Bang theory is saying, what general relativity, Einstein's theory, is saying, how time and space and matter are all intimately bound up together. Here's St. Augustine. You've seen a picture of him before. I think it's the same picture. Actually, he's portrayed as a scientist. You've got astronomical instruments and things knocking around in this picture. But anyway, he said, if the sacred and infallible scriptures say that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, then assuredly the world was made not in time, but simultaneously with time. So time and space and matter created together. He also said this: with the motion of creatures, time began to run its course. It is idle to look for time before creation, as if time can be found before time. We should therefore say that time began with creation rather than that creation began with time. But both are from God, for from him and through him and in him are all things. Interestingly enough, it's worth saying at this point that St. Augustine didn't take the early stories of Genesis literally, particularly Genesis chapter 1 with the 6 days. He used the term seed-like principles in English, rationes seminales, which God had implanted in the creation. So everything, the creation was all created at once together, but then unfolded as these causal principles that had been implanted in the creation came into their causal properties, started to instantiate further change in the universe. For example, he took, let the earth bring forth. Well, that is nature doing it through these causal principles. Now, what do we make then of the beginning? And one line of argument comes through Islamic thought in the medieval period. We've already mentioned somewhere that there was a great deal of what we'd call natural philosophy done in the Islamic world, as well as, of course, the medieval Christian world preceding what we call the scientific revolution. But anyway, this Kalam cosmological argument goes like this. It's now actually very much expanded by a chap called William Lane Craig, who's a Christian philosopher in the US, and also Robert Spitzer, who is a Jesuit, a Catholic priest, who expands this same argument. And it goes, everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause of its existence. So I think, certainly Lane Craig and others say that is virtually self-evident. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. And then, of course, they say that, well, this is what the Big Bang actually says. The universe began to exist 13.8 billion years ago, and therefore it's just a logical consequence that the universe has a cause of its existence. So, what do we make of this argument? And let me go into it in a bit more detail. Well, scientifically, there are problems about the beginning. As one goes further back in time towards the beginning, the physics which applies gets much less secure. And indeed, there's a lot of controversy about what theory might apply to the universe in the first 10 to the minus 43 seconds of its existence. There's 1 divided by 10 with 43 noughts after it. Go back 13.8 billion years, and you've got this tiny, tiny fraction of a second. Well, that's when you need a theory which combines gravity, Einstein's theory of gravity, general relativity, and quantum theory. And there are a number of candidates for that. So does that, or does that not eliminate the so-called singularity, where you get, if you just rely on general relativity, you certainly get the universe tracking back to a point, beginning. And there are various ways that scientists have tried to get round this idea of the beginning. And one is due to Stephen Hawking and his colleague Jim Hartle. And Hawking says this: there would be no... He's proposed something called the no boundary proposal, which I'll say a little bit about. And he says if this no boundary proposal applies, then you get the following. There would be no singularities at which the laws of science broke down, and no edge of space-time at which one would have to appeal to God or some new law to set the boundary conditions for space-time. One could say the boundary condition of the universe is that it has no boundary. The universe would be completely self-contained and not affected by anything outside itself. It would neither be created nor destroyed. It would just be. And I think there's a second quote. So long as the universe had a beginning, we could suppose that it had a creator. But if the universe is really completely self-contained, having no boundary or edge, it would have neither beginning nor end. It would simply be. What place, then, for a creator? Now, you see that Hawking finds the only role for God as creator to, as it were, as we say in England on bonfire night, light the blue touch paper to set the thing off, to set the rocket off, or to set the universe off. That's the only role for God. Well, in Christian theology, that's very far from being the only role for God, even perhaps not even the most significant one, as I'll explain in a moment. But anyway, notwithstanding that, it does seem that with this proposal anyway, Hawking hasn't actually got rid of the idea of the beginning. It's a very technical and sophisticated theory, and basically what it says is that when you track back the history of the universe to this very early period, time becomes imaginary. Now, those who are scientifically and mathematically trained will know what that word imaginary means. It has the technical meaning of imaginary numbers. And in terms of relativity, it means that time becomes like another space dimension. So you have 4 dimensions of space and none of time. Now, that poses certain both scientific and philosophical problems. In fact, if you've got no time dimension, you might ask yourself, but only space dimensions, you might ask yourself, well, how does change occur? Because the time dimension, is what measures change of state. And then, in fact, Hawking himself tells you can believe what you like about this imaginary time in terms of whether it's real, ontologically real, as opposed to mathematically real, or not, or whether only real time is ontologically real. This is a metaphysical, philosophical decision for you to take. I mean, in fact, it's purely, it could be taken purely instrumentally as just a way of doing the calculations. And Hawking says as much as that. But of course, if that's the case, then you haven't got round the beginning. You can make your choice and say only real time is ontologically real. And indeed, in his technical papers on this issue, Hawking says that actually the universe does have a beginning in time. It exists at where the boundary of it might be a fuzzy boundary, but where the 4-dimensional space and the 3 dimensions of space and time that we're used to intersect. So he hasn't actually got rid of the beginning. So it's important to realize that he says rather different things in his technical papers from what he says in his popular books, the Brief History of Time, and more recently his book with Leonard Mlodinow called The Grand Design. Now, this is a colleague of Hawking's called Alexander Vilenkin. And a few years ago, 5 years ago, January 5 years ago, there was a conference to celebrate Hawking's 70th birthday. It's truly remarkable that we're celebrating his 75th birthday this year. Utterly remarkable and wonderful that he's survived this long. But sadly, at this particular conference to celebrate his 70th, he couldn't be there. He was taken ill. But he sent a message saying if the universe had a beginning, then it would need God to create it. This man, Alexander Vilenkin, has proved certain singularity theorems which seem to apply to most cosmological models that are on offer. Namely that they all track back to a beginning. And Vilenkin spoke at this conference celebrating Hawking's 70th birthday and said, all the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. It's basically, if you just trace the back history of an imaginary photon back in time, you end up with it coming to a stop. So there does seem to be a beginning, and that seems to apply to various multiverse theories, which I'll talk about in my next talk. Maybe one would want to qualify that, given that we don't have the proper theory for the first tiny fraction of a second, but that's where we're at the moment anyway. We haven't avoided the beginning. Now let me say a little bit about the Christian doctrine of creation then now. Some scientists and some Christians seem to think that science and the Christian doctrine are contradictory, that Christians are somehow committed to a 6,000-year-old universe. Well, that's indeed, Dawkins and the people who take Genesis very literally on that would be at one, but that's not what has been the fundamental message of the Christian church, which has been creation ex nihilo, from nothing. That's really the heart of the Christian doctrine. And as regards the universe, and I'll say a bit more about this in a moment, that the universe itself is contingent, meaning that it may or may not have existed, and that it is dependent for its existence on God. And that is something that really, regardless of whether it has a finite or an infinite past history. But I will say just a little bit about pagan ideas about creation. And when we think about Genesis chapter 1 in particular, most biblical scholars would say that Genesis story comes against the backdrop of particularly the Babylonian myth, but maybe other myths of creation, being written probably during the exile in Babylon, and then the Hebrews would be hearing this Babylonian story. Well, in the Babylonian story, you get a battle of gods. The sea goddess, the monster god of chaos, the sea goddess Tiamat, is destroyed in battle by the chief god Marduk. Half of her is used to make the heavens, and half of her used to make the earth. The body of her consort Kingu is also destroyed. He's also destroyed in battle, and his entrails are used to make the human beings. The upshot of all that is that the creation is evil. It's made from evil gods and goddesses. Humans are evil. Humans are also made to do the dirty work of the gods. And I think what we need to do when we look at Genesis is to see it as a reaction very much against that. In Genesis, of course, the creation is good, created by the one God, the one true God. No battle of the gods. The sea is under God's control. The waters are divided by the firmament, the metal vault over the earth, and then the seas are put in their place when the dry land appears, and so on. Now, Plato in the Greek world is perhaps a bit more sophisticated than the Babylonians, but he nevertheless has an intermediary called the demiurge who creates. The demiurge creates by moulding pre-existent matter. And this pre-existing matter is resistant to the demiurge, recalcitrant matter. So again, for Plato, you have a perfect spiritual world, if you like, but you have an evil material world. And the idea is to escape. I mean, our souls come down and they're trapped in this material world, and they need to escape back up there, so to speak. It contrasts that with the Christian view of matter, which, again, going back to Genesis, it's good. And ultimately, for Christians, certainly matter is affirmed to be good because God becomes flesh. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So God takes on human flesh and becomes one of us in the incarnation. Just a bit again about going into this creation out of nothing idea. It's not absolutely clear in Genesis 1 that God creates from nothing. It's not specifically said, and there's some he's bringing order out of chaos. That's certainly a kind of theme. But is he literally creating out of nothing? And different Hebrew scholars read the first verses of Genesis in different ways on that. It's not totally clear that he's not creating out of pre-existing matter. But what he is doing, of course, is there's no matter that is not under God's control. God speaks and it happens. So it's not that there's matter that can resist the will of God. Far from it. But then the doctrine of creation out of nothing started to come along really during the Maccabean period in the 2nd century BC, and we have this statement. It's a rather gory story if you read this in 2 Maccabees about 7 Jewish brothers and their mother who are in turn, well, tortured in the most barbaric and cruel way by King Antiochus Epiphanes because they will not eat pork. They will not break the Jewish food laws, the kosher laws. Yes, they're dismembered and burned, and it's just horrible. But the mother, by the time it gets to she's encouraging her sons under the torture. And she says this when the last one is being tortured: "I beseech you, my child, to look at the heaven and the earth and to see everything that is in them and recognize that God did not make them out of things that existed." So this, I think, is possibly the first clearest statement we get in Judeo-Christian literature. This is from the Apocrypha, the intertestamental period between the Old and New Testaments, that God creates out of nothing. But then in the New Testament there are references which at least hint at the idea that God created out of nothing. Romans 4:17, God who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. So that would seem to be saying the same sort of thing. Hebrews 11:3, by faith we understand that the world was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was made out of things which do not appear. The great Christological passages, the beginning of John's Gospel, the prologue to John's Gospel, all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. That doesn't specifically say made by him out of nothing, however. But this is now the Word of God, of course, the Son, the second person of the Trinity. And in Colossians 1:16, 17, for in him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, so he's before all things, and in him all things hold together. That may be a temporal before, or it could, of course, be ontologically before. Everything depends on him, and certainly this latter statement, everything depends on him for its existence, is this idea of God sustaining the universe. There's a similar verse at the beginning of Epistle to the Hebrews. And then when we move into the period of the Apostolic Fathers and the Church Fathers, we start to get further, perhaps even more definitive statements. So this is from the Shepherd of Hermas, an early Christian document from the mid-2nd century, where we read that first of all believe that there is one God who created and finished all things and made all things out of nothing. So that is a pretty clear statement of the doctrine. Theophilus of Antioch similarly, and what great thing is it if God made the world out of existent materials, or even a human artist, when he gets his material from someone, makes of it what he pleases. But the power of God is manifested in this, that out of things that are not, he makes whatever he pleases. And then the great Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, one of the greatest of the early church fathers, says this: with him were always present the Word and wisdom, the Son and the Spirit, by whom and in whom freely and spontaneously he made all things. And he actually, I think, quotes Shepherd of Hermas, if I'm not mistaken. So we're already getting really here too the doctrine of the Trinity and the idea that the persons of the Trinity are involved in the creation. So creation ex nihilo became fixed and the Christian creed. I'm oscillating between theology and science here, which I hope is really what we ought to be doing somehow at the Faraday, but so here we are. Let me go back again to scientific reactions to the beginning. I've already spoken about Stephen Hawking, but there are various ideas. I'll go into the multiverse one tomorrow, but Vilenkin's theorems apply to various of the multiverse theories, including the kind of chaotic inflation theories I'll go into tomorrow. If they're part of the same space-time as many of these universes are deemed to be, then it still all tracks back ultimately to a single beginning. I've spoken about the Hartle-Hawking no-boundary proposal, the steady-state theory of Hoyle as well, and that one certainly was defeated by the Big Bang, but of course these theories come back in various different guises. I want to talk a bit about the quantum vacuum. Now, some physicists claim that the universe creates itself out of nothing, and then they redefine nothing to be something called the quantum vacuum. Now, vacuum might mislead you. I mean, vacuum sounds like nothing, but in quantum theory, the theory is very small. The vacuum is a hive of activity with particles spontaneously coming into existence, going out of existence, with quantum fields operating, and so on. Particularly, there's a man called Lawrence Krauss who follows this particular line. He redefines nothing to be the quantum vacuum, and then he says, lo and behold, a universe from nothing. We've bypassed God. The universe can bring itself into existence, lift itself up by its own bootstraps, by creating itself out of nothing. If that sounds odd to you, well, it sounds odd to me. And this is my take on the kind of mistake that's being made here. This is through the looking glass, and here we have Alice looking down the road, and here we have the king. And this is how the conversation goes. And you can see as we go through it how more and more confused it becomes. It's a rather long quote, but anyway. I see nobody on the road, said Alice. I only wish I had such eyes, the king remarked in a fretful tone, to be able to see nobody, and at that distance too. Who did you pass on the road, the king went on, holding out his hand to the messenger. Nobody, said the messenger. Quite right, said the king. This young lady saw him too. So, of course, nobody walks slower than you. I do my best, the messenger said in a sullen tone. I'm sure nobody walks much faster than I do. Oh, he can't do that, said the king, or else he'd have been here first. You see what's happening with nobody. There's two kinds of nobodies here. There's nobody with the small n, and then there's a capital nobody, which is a Mr. Nobody, a somebody with the name Nobody. So it seems to me that we're doing the same sort of thing with no thing and nothing. When we're talking about the quantum vacuum being nothing. When in fact, people like Krauss says it has all kinds of properties. Nothing has the property of being unstable, for example. Nothing can be unstable. So the nothing that Krauss and Hawking and so on are talking about in this sort of way, because Hawking says the same thing in some places, it has nothing really to do with the nothing that philosophers and theologians are talking about, the absence of anything at all. So let me summarize what I've been saying here. The universe then is totally, this is the heart of the doctrine of creation, and of the meaning of creation ex nihilo, that the universe is totally dependent on God for its existence at every moment, not just some first moment. And you can see this in one or two more of the quotes I've got, which I'll come to in a moment. So God does not have to deal with resistant, pre-existing matter over which he does not have control, as in Plato's scheme. God is totally sovereign over his creation. And God continues to uphold the universe in being and interact with his creation. So we get that again from the Colossians and Hebrews verses that I've mentioned. Let's go back to St. Augustine again, who puts this particularly clearly. When a builder puts up a house, his work remains in spite of the fact that he is no longer there. But the universe will pass away in the twinkling of an eye if God withdraws his ruling hand. That's really the meaning of creation out of nothing. Creation is continually upheld in being by God, moment by moment. And St. Thomas Aquinas, I'll have more to say about him in my next talk, said something very, very similar. For the essay, the being of all creaturely beings so depends upon God that they could not continue to exist even for a moment, but would fall away into nothingness unless they were sustained in existence by his power, as Gregory the Great, puts it. Now Aquinas also thought that the universe did have a beginning in time. That's how he read Scripture. And he read Genesis that way. And I've said that that's not 100% clear in Genesis. There's some controversy about whether it did. But he believed that. He believed that the universe had a beginning. But he thought that it was only faith and revelation, if you like, that could tell us that. By no demonstration can it be proved that the world did not always exist. So, having said that, though, St. Thomas did believe that the universe needed God to create it, whether or not it had a temporal beginning. And that's seen in his famous 5 ways, his arguments for the existence of God near the beginning of his great Summa Theologiae. And I'll just say a little bit about that, why there's still a need for God to create the universe if it has an infinite temporal past. There are some nevertheless, there are some problems with a temporal. I've already described some of them with the theories that are on offer, but there are some paradoxes and so on. But anyway, Aquinas wasn't considering those. I mean, the basic distinction is that only God can provide an explanation for why there is a universe at all, whether finite in the past or infinite. The universe doesn't explain itself, it doesn't bring itself into existence, and that is because of a fundamental distinction between God, who is necessary, and the universe, which is contingent, as I've already mentioned. So to say that God is necessary means that God cannot not exist. That's part of what we mean by the concept of God. Anything that's created, anything that came into existence is not God. So when Richard Dawkins asks, well, who made God then? He's fundamentally misunderstanding the meaning of the term. For anything that comes into existence is not God. You can argue about whether there is such a thing as a necessary being, whether God as a necessary being exists in the same way as, say, mathematical truth. 2 + 2 = 4 is necessarily true, cannot not be true. But it means that there never was when God was not, however you like to express it. That's the meaning. In contrast to the universe, which is contingent, which may or may not have existed, and could be different from what it is as well. And I'll go into that more in the next talk. So the interesting point is that what I've just said has actually been realized by some of the great cosmologists of our day, including no less than Stephen Hawking, because at the end of A Brief History of Time, he says this: what is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? Exactly. You can have the most wonderful physical theory. It can be string theory, M theory. I'll say a bit more about those in the next talk. But whatever the latest thing is, or Hawking's favorite, or whatever. But why is there a universe which that theory applies to? This is Martin Rees, colleague of Hawking's and still Astronomer Royal, senior astronomer in Britain, former Master of Trinity College here, and President of the Royal Society. So he says, such questions, why there is something at all, lie beyond science. They're the province of philosophers and theologians. And this man, this was a great cosmologist who was the doctoral supervisor of Hawking, Penrose, and indeed at an infinitely less exalted level of Rodney Holder. But he said, none of us can understand why there is a universe at all, why anything should exist. That's the ultimate question. Well, science doesn't tell you that. Theology can tell you that. All these three I've just named were, in Sharma's case, atheists. So science can't answer that question, and that's been recognized. Yes, I'm getting fairly near. So let me just kind of summarize what kind of explanation I think God provides. Well, I think God provides a personal explanation. The question of whether God is a person was raised earlier on. And I think that kettle illustration illustrates the difference between a personal explanation and an explanation in terms of scientific laws and initial conditions, which this is the kind of explanation that science provides. So they're different kinds of explanation. At its simplest, God answers the why question, a question about purpose and meaning and so on, and science answers the how question. How does nature progress from one state to another state over time? And in physics, you work that out by having your equations and evolving them over time. So rival explanations might be, in scientific terms, the Big Bang versus the steady state theory. The Big Bang versus God is not an alternative. Those are not alternatives. That's a mistake to say that, because they're on a different level. But metaphysical explanations might be that God made it, or that nobody made it, it just is, it's a brute fact, or that it's just some kind of gigantic accident. But those would be metaphysical explanations, or really, non-explanations in a sense. At this point, you kind of give up if you're. I think the scientific attitude myself is to take explanation as far as it will go, and therefore we do have an explanation in terms of God, but not otherwise. So what does God explain? Well, God explains why science explains. It's not an alternative to science. It explains why science explains. It explains why there is a universe, as I've said. And it explains why the universe is set up the way it is, and that's, I think, the cue for my next talk, which is more to do with the way the universe is set up. So I think that's actually my last slide, and yeah, not quite beaten Alistair, but 301.
Thank you very much, Rodney, for introducing us to very, very big questions. These are, by definition, the biggest questions. So we have time for questions and discussion. I guess maybe I would like to start out just by asking, has your own contemplation of the universe and its beginning, has it evolved at all in your own thinking over time, or your own theology, the way you look at this? Has this changed at all?
Well,
your own?
I think from my, from studying, I'm wanting to be an astronomer since I was age 7, and had a relatively short period doing it, but it was wonderful, and I think even from those days I was overawed by the stars and the universe, and getting a small telescope and all these kind of things you do as a boy. And I think when I became a Christian, I think the idea that it was God's creation, it's just sheer awe and wonder for me. And some of my favorite Bible passages, when I look at thy heavens, the moon and the stars which thou hast created, ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him, the son of man that thou shouldest visit him. That just for me is what's breathtaking. Whether I think I mostly in terms of my own kind of academic pursuit on this, I've focused on the fine-tuning, which I'll talk about next talk. But I think, I've been ambivalent about this idea of the beginning. and whether one should or shouldn't make an argument about it. I think there is a certain strength of the argument these days. It kind of looks like the universe had a beginning, but I'm not 100% sure that that's the last word on it, and whether, if we do get a better theory, out of these various competing theories, whether, the singularity will be avoided or not, and so on. So I haven't really, done so much thinking about that, though I have looked at, Hawking's theory in particular, and looked at what he said in his original papers, did that a little while ago, and compared them. I think, if the universe, and it's probably a more straightforward reading of Scripture to say, yes, it had a beginning. And it's something that gives the atheists more problems, it seems to me, than it gives Christians, than the universe not having a beginning gives Christians. I think the atheists have got the problem with it, like Fred Hoyle and Bondi and Gould, who were all atheists who came up with the steady-state theory in the beginning. And I think there were anti-theological motivations at work. So I think they have a bit of a problem if there is a beginning. If there is a literal beginning, then how do you explain it? I mean, that's massive. Whereas theology can explain it either way. So I think that's what I'd want to say.
We have a question.
Thank you again. If God did create the universe, I just something that troubles me is the awful overinvestment of matter and material and galaxies just to put us on this tiny planet. Can I have your opinion or your thoughts on that, please?
Yes. Well, again, this might encroach slightly on the second talk I'm going to give, but one of the things that this discovery of the anthropic principle has shown us is that the universe needs to be as big as it is, as old as it is, for life to exist anywhere within it. We've had this move in science, since the time of Copernicus, ostensibly to move humans away from the center to more and more the periphery, to just like some kind of froth on the edge of some ordinary galaxy, which in one sense we are. But the universe does seem to need to be as big as it is, as old as it is, in order to have the chemical elements produced and all the other things to happen. Life takes billions of years to evolve. Now, there is a question which, of course, then arises about whether life has evolved elsewhere, and the kind of things I'll go into in the next talk are conditions for there being life anywhere. So God may indeed be interested in creating life many times, for all I know. In one sense, we're back in the center through the anthropic principle, but we might not be alone. God could create many other civilizations elsewhere in this vast universe and have an interest in them. And I think Andrew Davison later on in the week is going to be talking about that, so I won't preempt that anymore.
Would you elaborate a bit on the idea of God explaining why science explains? Because I'm not sure where we can get that information from.
Well, yes. Now, Einstein's great conundrum was, why is the universe comprehensible? That is the most mysterious thing about the universe, why it is comprehensible. It needn't be. I think Bob said this earlier on. It needn't be open to our investigation and understanding at all. Now, if we are made in the image of God, then it is explicable as to why we can understand the universe if we're made in God's image, as we're told in Genesis. So then, and if the universe is somehow matched to our capacity for understanding, I mean, this was thought about again by medieval theologians, intellectus ad rem, I think they called it, that our mind is attuned to the thing, to the universe. And so Christian theology does explain why it's open to our understanding and therefore, and our modus of understanding, our way of understanding through science.
I'm sorry, right here on the second row, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Holder. Would there be any advantage in believing that the world is just a few thousand years old?
I don't see any advantage in that. I think, personally, I think it's a big mistake. It's a big mistake from a point of view of exegesis of the scriptures, it seems to me, fundamentally. And I think one needs to understand, as I explained just very, very briefly, the context in which those scriptures were written and the job they were trying to do at the time. They're not modern science. And as the church fathers like Origen and Augustine said, for example, what does it mean to have 3 24-hour days before there's a sun? What is a 24-hour day without the sun? It comes on day 4. Well, and I'm not saying that to ridicule, actually far from it. I'm saying it to bring alive what it's actually doing. In the Babylonian pantheon, the sun and the moon were gods in their own right. And if you were to give Shamash and Sin, I think, if you were to give them their names, they would be names of gods to be worshipped. If you remember, on day 4, God creates a greater light and a lesser light. They're not even given their names. They're demoted from the pantheon. So we need to realize what this text is doing. And in terms of taking it literally, it's extremely difficult, it seems to me, to do that. That's one reason, sun on day 4. Another reason is, on day 2, God creates what in older translations is called the firmament, which is basically a metal dome over the earth. You read in the flood story that God opens the windows of this metal dome, the firmament, for the waters above to come down and so on, and then the floods from under. And then the order of creation in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is literal. So you have to make a choice there. Of course, Augustine himself was more literal about Genesis 2. He realized that you couldn't take both literally. Another point Augustine made rather interestingly was, well, of course, when it's evening in one part of the world, because by his time we knew that the world was spherical, and it's morning in another time. So there was evening and there was morning, the first day. Again, you see, literally speaking, it's very hard to make sense of it. But doesn't stop a lot of people trying to do so, I know that, but there you are.
Okay, I'm going to try to keep this in order of hands that went up, but please forgive me if I mess up. So there you go.
Thank you, Dr. Holder. Are you an advocate of the Kalam cosmological argument or not?
I can see something in it. I'm not 100%, but at the moment it looks as though it's. But when I say at the moment, what troubles me is that and with Vilenkin's theorems, yes, it accords with them. But maybe we'll get a
I think
a better.
The first premise, people might accuse you of the fallacy of composition, in terms of just because it seems to be the case that everything that begins to exist does have a cause, doesn't necessarily mean the universe has a cause. And also,
true,
me affirms false, but in quantum physics, don't particles come into existence?
They do.
And if they might say that if particles can come into existence, why can't the universe just pop into being from nothing?
Well, that's what they do say, but that's they're coming into existence and annihilating in this quantum vacuum and according to quantum laws. So you're always saying, well, why are there these laws that dictate, annihilation and creation, annihilation and creation operators and all that? Where do all these things come from? There's always, science always starts from something, it seems to me, and goes from one state to another state. I don't see how science can get round that.
Okay, how about we'll go I see you back there, but let's go one row here, and then we'll get to your question back
So
there.
it's
There you
just
go.
more convenient, maybe. Thank you. I'm just wondering what your commentary or maybe what your comments are on, there's a prevailing view out there where the Genesis 1 narrative is from, it's a creation from the Earth's perspective. So that, you know, how the days go is, it makes sense if it was from an observer from the surface of the Earth and so on and so forth.
I still don't see how, well, I mean, yes, in a sense. I mean, it looks like, if you look at a clear blue sky, and if you look at a clear blue sky when you're in the Middle East, you probably see that, you know, very often. You might take that to be a solid vault. I mean, we see, you know, from the Earth's perspective, we see the sun going around the Earth. So, you know, we're geocentric. But I don't see how, I still don't see how that gets us to the literal meaning, a literal, you know, that account being literally true.
I think there are people that have a more concordist view
Yeah.
of, sort of like Hugh Ross,
Yes.
Yeah.
from Reasons
Exactly.
to Believe, who would
Yeah.
say that the days in Genesis, while they may not be 24-hour periods, but they represent the epochs of creation as might be observed from an observer on Earth, on the ground. So that's another perspective that's out there.
Well, yes. Well, my perspective is much more a literary thing than attempting any kind of science. And I think to see it, it's really quite anachronistic to read modern science into it. I think, I seem to remember in one place, in one of his books, which I reviewed a number of years ago, so my memory may be a bit hazy, but Hugh Ross seemed to say that you know, when God stretches out the heavens, this is actually, you know, this is general relativity. This is the expansion of space. When you look at the text, frankly, that's nonsense. What he's doing is beating out the metal vault, the firmament. That's what the words mean in the context. So, you know, this concordist idea just doesn't work, it seems to me, I'm afraid.
So it's an issue with how you
Yeah.
interpret Scripture,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
originally intended meanings and contexts and.
Well, very much so. I think you need to read it in its context and then see what the eternal truths are there. It's not trying to teach science, it seems to me. I mean, there's a logical structure to Genesis 1. You have the arenas, if you like, created, and then you have those which fill them. You have the darkness, the light and the darkness on day 1, on day 4, the sun and the moon which rule them. You have the waters, you know, the separation, so the waters above and the waters below, and then you've got the flying creatures across the firmament on day 5. And then and the sea creatures, and then you've got the land and the sea, and you've got the land creatures and ultimately humans. So you have there's a kind of logical structure to it, but it just doesn't seem to me to make any kind of historical sense.
There's a patient gentleman back there. Yes.
Do you see any significant developments over the next few years, either from a cosmological point of view or a theological point of view, in terms of us perhaps obtaining a more informed understanding of the relationship between science in general and theology?
Well, science is changing all the time, but and you know, I mean, Jennifer will know, and you'll get a talk from Paul Shellard later this week. I mean, cosmology is moving at an incredibly fast pace, and actually, a lot of the observational work is just absolutely fantastic. Some of the kind of stuff you talk about with finding exoplanets, it's so kind of delicate. It's wonderful stuff. The theory, it seems to me, is outstripping the observations at the moment. And I'll say a bit more about that in my next talk. But it always sort of somehow brings you back to the same theological questions. It seems to me, which and a lot of atheists operate in a perhaps not a quantum vacuum, but a vacuum in thinking, theologians have never thought about these things. And you go back into, and theology is always engaging with its great figures of the past, the Augustine and Aquinas and so on. So, and they've thought about these issues very deeply. And the science, will give us the detail of the how of the creation, like I've said, but and it'll fill more and more in. But at the moment, we always think we've got to the end of the road. This idea of the theory of everything that people moot. Well, sorry.
I realise it's something of a crystal ball type question.
Yeah, well, it is a bit, and it seems to me that whenever we answer one question in science, it opens up 10 more. It doesn't close things down. It doesn't. Yeah. People thought at the end of the 19th century, as is well known, that everything was sewn up, just measuring, the charge on the electron to another few decimal places or something, and then, at the beginning of the 20th century, revolutions with quantum theory and special and general relativity, everything changed. And maybe, we're in for more of that, which is very exciting and thrilling.
So I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
How important do you think it really is for people with theological views to think that there was a beginning? Is that really something that you would use as an apologetic for your faith? Because couldn't you imagine philosophically the counter argument that maybe if God has always been, that there's no beginning or no end to God, that maybe it would be more in keeping with that kind of God to have a creation that had no beginning and no end?
Well, yes,
so
yes.
Is it really important to base one's view of a beginning as a crux, issue or not?
Well, I think there is a certain danger in it. I think there is a certain danger in it. As I've sort of said, it looks like there was a beginning at the moment, and there are various other arguments you can bring to bear. For example, to do with the second law of thermodynamics. Well, the universe is winding down. Well, if it's had an infinite past, why hasn't it wound down now? There's those sorts of arguments. It certainly looks as though it had a beginning, and there are these paradoxes of infinity.
Maybe I'm talking about the multiverse.
Yeah, well, I'll come into the multiverse next talk, but just briefly on a beginning. Alice has been counting backwards for infinite time, and she comes to minus 5, minus 4, minus 3, minus 2, minus 1, 0. Hang on, she's been counting for an infinite length of time. Well, hasn't she got there infinitely long ago? You start to, and there are similar sorts of paradoxes about multiverse, about spatial multiverses as opposed to temporal, going back infinitely far in the past, which I might mention in the next talk as well. So,
just wondering if it's really a smart thing to pin one's philosophy on a certain view of a certain model of science and vice versa.
Well, this is what Lane Craig certainly does. William Lane Craig certainly makes a great thing about the Kalam cosmological argument, and much more than the fine. I think the better argument is the fine-tuning one myself. But again, there are debates about that, as you well know. We'll come on to that.
Okay, one or two more questions here. Who hasn't? How about this gentleman here? I thought I saw a hand way back there. Was there a? Don't be shy, those of you in the back rows. Yes.
You mentioned the work of Lawrence Krauss. He wrote that book for a popular audience.
Yeah.
My question is he reporting what serious cosmologists really believe about this quantum vacuum, or is this a caricature of the real science for the purpose of selling books?
Well, I think that I think the calling it nothing is perhaps the polemical, popular kind of thing, a universe from nothing. Whereas certainly, there's been a lot about the quantum vacuum for actually many years. When was what was the guy? The name E.P. Tryon. Now, when was that? Many years ago now. Someone called E.P. Tryon came up with an original theory, which was rather like these modern quantum vacuum theories. That's probably 50 years ago or more. I forget when he was. But that's certainly talked about. That, you know, somehow there's some kind of runaway effect. I mean, mostly these particles just annihilate. So there's got to be some kind of runaway effect, which whereby they, they don't annihilate immediately and sort of run away. They get, well, yeah. There's the so-called cosmological constant, which I might talk about a bit.
Okay,
Yes.
so I have a back row question. Yes.
Dr. Holder, both Dr. Guth and Dr. Vilenkin, from the Bode-Guth-Vilenkin theorems,
Yeah.
they say that definitely there has been a proof that
Yeah.
there is no past eternal universe.
Yeah.
That the universe had a beginning, whether it's a multiverse or not.
Yes, exactly.
And yet, both of them, when they were asked, they say they don't know. They say,
Yeah.
for example, Vilenkin says in his book, Many Worlds in One, that there's a proof in place.
Yeah.
And yet, when they are asked, I think it was in a debate that Lawrence Krauss presents a board with Dr. Guth saying, I don't know if there was a beginning. Why is it that Christian cosmologists and astrophysicists can't have that knockout punch with this?
Well, I think what those theorems don't do is take account of. They are based, I think, essentially on general relativity alone. So not on a quantum gravity theory. So they're tracking, and it's under the assumption that there is an overall positive Hubble constant, in other words, an overall expansion. And if you do that, and you take an imaginary photon or whatever, and track back its history, you find that it comes to a stop. But it may be ignoring other things that need to be taken into account, which would modify it, I suppose. Maybe that's why they're saying that, I don't know. But we don't have anything else to go on at the moment. We just have those theorems. All the evidence we have, as Vilenkin said, is that the universe had a beginning.
All right, any final burning question? Yes, we have one over here.
Well, I've heard people say that it's possible that God created the earth and made it look like it was very old.
Yeah.
Just the way when Adam was created, that very first day, he was capable of being a father. So the earth also it looked like it was old already.
Yeah.
Now, is it dangerous to have that view?
Well, this is a God, in this view, who deceives us. A God who deliberately makes the earth look old when it isn't, if that's what God does. And that doesn't sound like the God of the Bible to me, a God who is deliberately deceptive. I think that would be my answer to that. I mean, there was a famous argument in the 19th century. Actually, Dennis here in the front row knows a lot more about this chap. The Omphalos chap. Goss, Philip Goss. Thank you. Birds came into existence with bits of food in their mouth. The question is, did Adam have a navel? Well, yeah, it was made to look as though he had a mother and so on. But the world it all came into existence kind of, just so, 4004 BC or whatever. And that's an extreme view, concordist view, if you like. It could be so, but I have I can't prove that I just came into existence 5 minutes ago, actually, with all my memories of the past, basically completely fictitious.